She won't last 7 days. Nathaniel Caldwell said it without lowering his voice, didn't care who heard. Eleanor Bennett had barely set her trunk down on the front steps of his estate when those words reached her ears, clear as a bell on a cold Virginia morning. She didn't flinch, didn't turn around, just smoothed the front of her dress and kept walking. If you've ever been written off by someone who didn't know the first thing about you, stay right here. Subscribe to this channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from today? The road to Caldwell Estate was longer than Eleanor Bennett had expected, and the October air carried a bite that made her glad she'd worn her wool traveling coat, the dark gray one her father had bought her 3 years before he died. The coat was beginning to show its age, the cuffs a shade thinner than they used to be, the hem slightly frayed, but it was hers, and she wore it without apology. She had not come to Caldwell Estate looking for charity. She had come because Henry Whitaker, the estate's head steward, had placed an advertisement in the Richmond Gazette, seeking a records manager and household librarian. Someone with organizational skills, a working knowledge of accounts, and the ability to maintain discretion. Eleanor Bennett had all three. She also had something the advertisement hadn't asked for, but that she suspected would prove useful: the particular patience of a woman who had learned early and often that the world was not going to make things easy for her. The driver brought the hired conveyance to a stop at the main approach, and Eleanor stepped down without waiting for assistance. She carried her own trunk to the bottom step. Not because she was proving a point. Because there was no one offering to help, and she had never been the kind of woman who waited for rescue when 2 capable hands were already attached to her body. That was when she heard it. The voice came from somewhere just inside the wide front entrance, deep, unhurried, carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. 7 days, that's my estimate. She'll be gone inside a week. Eleanor's hands did not loosen on the handle of her trunk. Her spine did not change its angle. She stood exactly as she had been standing at the base of the steps of Caldwell Estate, in the thin autumn light, and she absorbed those words the way a well-built wall absorbs rain thoroughly, without visible damage. She looked up at the entrance. She had known this would not be a warm welcome. She had not expected warmth. What she had not anticipated was having her departure predicted before she had even been introduced. It was the kind of remark that was meant to be overheard. That was the worst of it, not the cruelty, but the carelessness. The assumption that it didn't matter if she heard it because she wouldn't be around long enough for it to signify. Eleanor picked up her trunk, climbed the first step, and then the second, and then the third, and walked through the entrance as though the words had been spoken about someone else entirely. Nathaniel Caldwell had not been looking at Eleanor Bennett when he said it. He had been looking at Henry Whitaker, his steward of 18 years, a man with a face like a map of every hard season the estate had weathered, and the good judgment to know when his employer was being unreasonable without ever being foolish enough to say so plainly. Henry had brought the advertisement to Nathaniel's attention 3 weeks ago. The estate's records were a disaster, not because anyone had been dishonest exactly, but because the previous records keeper, an elderly man named Forsyth, had developed a system so particular to his own mind that no one else could navigate it, and Forsyth himself had retired to his daughter's farm in Fredericksburg 6 months ago without leaving anything resembling an explanation. The library was a graveyard of unlabeled boxes. The account ledgers from the past 4 years did not speak to one another. There were land deeds filed under categories that appeared to have been invented entirely at random. Henry had wanted to hire a solicitor's clerk, a young man from Richmond who came with references and a respectable family name. Nathaniel had agreed, and then the clerk had accepted a position elsewhere, and time had continued passing, and the records had continued being a disaster, and Henry had quietly placed a different advertisement and received among various applications, one from a woman named Eleanor Bennett, daughter of Reverend Thomas Bennett of Culpeper County, deceased, with a letter of reference from the rector of St. John's Parish, describing her as, quote, a person of uncommon organizational capacity and absolute reliability. Nathaniel had not hired her. He had told Henry to hire her, which was a different thing. He had not expected to have an opinion about it. He had formed one the moment Henry pointed her out through the window. She was younger than he'd expected. She was also, and this was the part that had made him say what he said entirely, without the air of nervous performance that newcomers to Caldwell Estate almost universally displayed. The young men who came to work here spent their first hour trying to look as though they belonged. Eleanor Bennett walked up his front steps as though she was simply going somewhere she had decided to go, and that was the end of it. It irritated him for reasons he didn't pause to examine. 7 days, he repeated to no one in particular, turning from the window. We'll see. Henry did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was perfectly level. Yes, sir. I reckon we will. Eleanor was shown to her rooms by a housemaid named Clara, a girl of perhaps 17, who had the quick sidelong eyes of someone accustomed to moving through a house without drawing attention to herself. Clara showed Eleanor the library, a large room off the east corridor, and the small office adjacent to it, which would be her workspace, and the room she would sleep in, which was at the end of the servants' hall, and was plain but clean, with a window that faced the kitchen garden. Clara hesitated at the door, fingers turning over themselves in her apron. Is there anything else you need, miss? Not tonight. Eleanor set her traveling bag on the chair. Clara, how long have you been in service here? The girl looked surprised to be asked. 4 years, miss, since I was 13. Then you know this house well. I suppose I do. Good, Eleanor told her. I may ask for your guidance on certain things once I've found my footing. Nothing that would put you in a difficult position. I'm not asking you to carry tales. Only the kind of thing that a new person can't learn from ledgers. Clara studied her for a moment, with those quick eyes reassessing something. Then she gave a small, careful nod. Yes, miss, I can do that. When Clara left, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 5 minutes. Not to rest, she wasn't tired enough for rest. But because she had learned over 26 years of life, and the last 4 of them without a family home to return to, that the moments directly after a beginning were important ones to sit with. To be honest with yourself about what you were walking into. She was walking into a house whose owner had already decided she would fail. A house with records in disorder, which suggested either negligence or concealment, and she wouldn't know which until she'd had time to look. A house where she had no allies, no standing beyond a letter from a dead man's parish, and no margin for error of the kind that a woman of her position could afford to make. She also had a talent for order that bordered on the constitutional, a memory for figures that had made her father shake his head in fond bewilderment, and an absolute refusal to be rattled by a man who formed opinions through windows. She had been told she wouldn't last 7 days. Eleanor pulled out the notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Small leather bound the pages, already half filled with her father's quotes and her own observations, and she wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. October 14th, 1818. Day 1. Then she put the notebook away, stood up, and got to work. The library was worse than she had been told. This did not discourage her, if anything the opposite. A problem with clear dimensions was a problem with a clear solution, and Eleanor Bennett had always found that the people who called chaos overwhelming were simply people who hadn't yet learned to see the order hiding inside it. She spent the first 2 days doing nothing but cataloging. Not organizing, just cataloging. Making a list of what existed where she found it and what condition it was in. She filled 12 pages of her notebook. She found letters misfiled with land surveys. She found receipts tucked inside volumes of Virgil. She found a deed for a parcel of land near the Blue Ridge, 17 acres, filed under the heading Miscellaneous Correspondence, which was the filing equivalent of dropping something in a ditch and walking away. She also found a pattern of irregularities in the household accounts that she didn't understand yet and wasn't going to pretend to understand. Not missing money exactly, or at least nothing she could say with certainty was missing. But numbers that didn't answer to one another. Credits that appeared without corresponding records. Line items that repeated at intervals that seemed just slightly too regular to be coincidence. She wrote it all down. She said nothing. On the 3rd morning, she came to breakfast in the servants' hall to find that her usual place at the end of the table had been taken by one of the younger footmen, and the remaining space was at the middle of the bench, where she would be crowded between the cook's assistant and a man whose name she hadn't yet learned. She sat down without comment, thanked the cook when her plate was set in front of her, and ate her breakfast. On the 4th morning, Her cataloging materials had been moved from the side table in the library to a less convenient corner. The footman she had learned his name was Robert gave her a sideways look when she passed him in the corridor. It was a testing look, the kind that said, "Let's see what you do with that." Eleanor moved her materials back. She did it quietly, without explanation or complaint, as though it had simply been a mistake that needed correcting. She did not look for Robert to inform him of this. On the fifth morning, Henry Whittaker appeared in the library doorway. He was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades managing the expectations of others. He looked at the organized spread of her work. 12 pages of Catalog 4, separate stacks of documents sorted by type and approximate date. 2 lists of questions with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Miss Bennett." He stepped inside. "May I ask what system you're using?" Chronological within category cross-referenced by subject where the document touches more than one matter. She set down her pen. The current arrangement, the one Mr. Forsyth established, has some logic to it, but the categories are too idiosyncratic for another person to navigate reliably. I intend to maintain a parallel index until the new system is complete, so nothing is lost during the transition. Henry was quiet for a moment. He picked up the nearest stack, glanced through the top 3 documents, and set them back down. "That deed for the Harlan parcel," he said. "The one near the ridge. Did you happen to find it?" "Yes, it was filed under miscellaneous correspondence." She reached into the second stack and withdrew it precisely. "I've flagged it. The registration date may need to be confirmed against the county record. The notation in the margin is faded, and I want to be certain before I enter it formally." Henry looked at the deed. Then he looked at her. "You've been at this for 4 days." "5, Eleanor said, counting the day I arrived." Another pause. Something shifted in the lines of his face. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of a recalibration. "The household accounts," he said carefully. "Have you had occasion to review them?" "I've reviewed 4 years of ledgers as background for the record system. They're complex." She held his gaze. "I have some questions when you have time." Henry Whittaker nodded. Slowly, like a man making a decision he hadn't entirely finished making yet. "I'll make time tomorrow morning," he told her. The 6th day brought Victoria Ashford. Eleanor knew who she was before anyone told her. The way the household rearranged itself around a woman's arrival was telling, the quickened step in the corridors, the flowers brought in from the kitchen garden, the particular alertness in the footman near the front door. This was not a routine visitor. This was someone who had standing in this house that Eleanor would never have. Victoria Ashford was 28, the daughter of Judge Ashford of Henrico County, and she arrived with a small retinue, a maid, a companion, and the kind of easy social confidence that came from never having had reason to doubt her welcome anywhere. She was beautiful in a composed way, with pale hair and steady gray eyes, and she moved through the front hall as though she had already mentally redecorated it. Eleanor observed all of this from the doorway of the East Corridor, catalog pages in hand, and she registered something she was honest enough to name not jealousy. Something quieter and less comfortable than jealousy. The recognition that there were categories of life she was not in, and that those categories were not going to open up simply because she was competent. She turned back to the library. She was halfway through resorting the correspondence files when she heard the voice, Nathaniel Caldwell's, closer than she'd expected and accompanied by another set of footsteps in the corridor. She didn't look up. "The East Wing Records Room." His voice paused just outside the library door, which was open. "We keep the household management here now. Miss Bennett, our records keeper." There was a pause. Then Victoria Ashford appeared in the doorway, and Eleanor stood, because that was what you did, and she met those gray eyes with the same steadiness she brought to everything. "Miss Bennett." Victoria's voice was pleasant. Genuinely so, not performative. "I understand you've been making some sense of what Mr. Forsyth left behind." "I've been working on it, yes ma'am. Henry tells me you've already found the Harlan deed." Victoria glanced at Nathaniel, and something passed between them, some shared reference Eleanor wasn't privy to. "That deed has been lost for the better part of a year. We were beginning to think it would have to be reissued." "It wasn't lost," Eleanor said. It was misfiled. Victoria smiled, a real one, the kind that reached the eyes. That is a very useful distinction. She looked around the library. You've brought some order to this room, Miss Bennett. It's apparent even to a visitor. Eleanor said thank you. She meant it. She also noticed that Nathaniel Caldwell, standing just inside the door, with his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression revealing approximately nothing, had not spoken directly to her once since her arrival. He looked at her now in the way a man looks when someone else has said something that forces him to actually look. Eleanor met his gaze, held it for exactly the length of time that was appropriate. Then she looked back at her work. On the evening of the 6th day, Robert the footman came to the library with an apology so stiff it might have been ironed along with his livery. He'd been the one moving her materials, he admitted, not under instruction, just he stumbled over a vague word or two. Just testing, miss. He finally landed on which was at least honest. Eleanor studied him for a moment. I appreciate you telling me. She kept her voice entirely neutral. I'll ask you to leave my materials where I put them going forward. It slows the work when things aren't where they need to be. He nodded. Then he surprised her. You found the Harlan deed, he said. Couldn't find it before. Mr. Caldwell was some put out about it. It takes time to see a new system, Eleanor said. That's all. Robert nodded again and left, and Eleanor thought, well, that's one. On the morning of the 7th day, Eleanor arrived in the library to find Henry Whittaker already there, seated at the side table with 2 cups of tea and the account ledgers she had flagged spread in front of him. His face was the face of a man who had been up for a while. Tell me what you found, he said. Eleanor sat down across from him. She opened her notebook to the pages she'd set aside for this purpose, and she walked him through it methodically, without accusation, the way you laid out evidence in front of someone who needed to see it for themselves. The credits that appeared without corresponding records. 11 of them over 4 years, ranging in size from $12 to over $100. Always in the fall quarter. Always attributed in the ledger to a line item labeled Improvements Land Management, which was a category broad enough to cover nearly anything. I don't know if this is an error, Eleanor said carefully. The records I have access to don't tell me, but it's a pattern, Mr. Whittaker, and patterns in accounts usually have explanations. Henry stared at the ledger. His jaw had gone tight. Who else have you told about this? No one. She held his gaze. I brought it to you. Why? Not hostile, genuinely asking. Because you're the person responsible for these accounts, she told him. And because if this is something that needs to be examined, it's better examined quietly by someone with the authority to do it than in a way that causes damage before anything is understood. Henry was silent for a long moment. Outside the estate was beginning its morning. She could hear horses, and somewhere the distant sound of someone splitting wood. The improvements line, he said at last. I've been questioning it myself. I didn't have the records to pin it down. He looked at her notebook. You've done it in 5 days. 7, Eleanor said, and almost smiled. Counting the day I arrived. Something shifted in Henry's expression, a crack in the careful neutrality, something closer to genuine feeling. He said you wouldn't last the week, Henry said quietly. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. Eleanor closed her notebook. She picked up the cup of tea. It had gone slightly cool, and she took a sip. The week isn't over yet, she told him. That afternoon, Nathaniel Caldwell came to the library. He didn't knock. Men with estates like Caldwell didn't knock on doors inside their own houses. He walked in and stopped, and Eleanor, who was in the middle of cross-referencing a land survey against a county map she'd borrowed from the estate's document chest, looked up and waited. He stood there with his hands behind his back, and the expression of a man who wanted to say something and hadn't quite figured out how to say it without it sounding like something it wasn't. Henry tells me you've been reviewing the accounts. His voice was level, neutral. He says you found something. I found a series of irregularities, Eleanor said. I've shared my notes with Mr. Whittaker. I thought it was his place to bring them to you. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. You could have come to me directly. I could have. She set down her pen. You're the owner of this estate, and you have every right to receive information about it directly. But I've been here 7 days, and I have no standing in this house beyond what the work establishes. Bringing an accusation, even a quiet one, to you, before I'd confirmed that Mr. Whitaker was not himself already aware of the problem, would have been imprudent. There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant he was considering something he hadn't expected to have to consider. "You thought Henry might be involved," he said slowly. "I thought it was possible. I didn't know either way. So I watched for a few days before I said anything to anyone." Another pause. Longer. "That's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's a careful way to think." I reckon it seemed that way. She didn't know exactly why she used the word. It wasn't her usual speech. It was his territory. This Virginia plainness that men like him wore like a second coat. But it landed somewhere because something in his jaw shifted. "Miss Bennett." He didn't look away from her. "I want to see your notes." "Of course." She opened her notebook to the relevant pages and slid it across the work table. He read in silence. She did not watch him read. She went back to her county map, traced a boundary line with her fingertip, made a note in the margin. She was aware of him, the way you were aware of weather not looking at it, but knowing exactly where it was. 11 entries, he said finally. Over 4 years, always the fall quarter. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. "Do you know who—" She looked up then, met his eyes directly. "I have a suspicion," she said carefully. "But a suspicion without evidence is just an accusation waiting to damage the wrong person. The evidence is in the purchase records for Improvements Land Management, which I don't currently have access to. If someone were to pull those from the secondary archive, I'll pull them. Then we'll know." He looked at her for a moment that stretched past the length of what the conversation required. She had heard his voice 6 days ago, saying 7 days, with the comfortable certainty of a man announcing the weather. She looked at him now, and she felt not triumph, exactly something steadier than triumph. The quiet satisfaction of having been exactly who she was in exactly the way she'd chosen to be it, and having that turn out to be enough. Not more than enough. Not less. Exactly enough. "I believe," Nathaniel Caldwell said at last, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard there before. Not warmth yet, but the absence of dismissal, which in its own way was a beginning, "that you may be rather more useful than I anticipated." Eleanor picked up her pen. "I believe I told you nothing to the contrary," she said, and went back to work. I was quiet for a long moment before he left. And if he paused at the door just for a moment, the length of a breath, Eleanor didn't look up to see it. She was busy. There was a great deal still to do. And she had not, as it turned out, left in 7 days. The purchase records for Improvements Land Management arrived on Eleanor's work table the following morning, delivered by Henry Whitaker himself, wrapped in brown paper and tied with cord as though they were something fragile. He set them down without ceremony, pulled the door almost shut behind him, and stood with his arms crossed in the way of a man who wanted to look patient and wasn't quite managing it. Eleanor cut the cord with the small penknife she kept in her desk drawer and unwrapped the stack without hurrying. There were 6 years of records more than she'd asked for, which meant Henry had been thinking about this longer than he'd let on. She noted that, filed it away, and opened the topmost ledger. Henry watched her read. She didn't speak for a good 20 minutes. She moved through the records methodically, cross-referencing against the notes she'd made in her own notebook, occasionally pausing to reread a line or make a small annotation in the margin. Henry refilled his coffee cup from the pot on the side table. He did not sit down. He was too unsettled to sit. Finally, Eleanor set the last page flat and pressed her palm gently on top of it. "The entries I flagged in the household accounts," she said quietly. "They correspond to payments made to a supplier listed as R. Greer Agricultural Provisions, Staunton." She looked up at Henry. "Have you done business with R. Greer of Staunton?" Henry's expression answered the question before he did. "Not that I'm aware of." "Then someone has been using the estate's accounts to pay a supplier that doesn't appear in any of the Caldwell household records I've seen. Not in the vendor correspondence, not in the receiving logs, not in the inventory tallies." She kept her voice even. "Either Mr. Greer is a vendor whose records were lost, which is possible but unlikely given how systematic the omission is, or someone has been directing estate funds to an account they control. The silence in the library was complete. Henry sat down. Eleanor waited. She had learned the value of waiting, of letting a truth settle into a room before anyone tried to do something about it. Men who had spent decades managing other people's property had a particular kind of pride, and that pride required a moment to absorb a blow before it could function clearly again. James Alcott, Henry said at last, the name coming out flat and tired. The land manager. He's been with this estate for 11 years. I don't know it's him, Eleanor said. I haven't said that. No, but R. Greer of Staunton would be. He stopped, set his jaw. Alcott's wife's family name is Greer. Her people are from Augusta County. The fire in the grate shifted. A log fell with a soft sound. Eleanor closed her notebook. Mr. Whitaker. She chose her words with the precision of someone laying out something delicate. I don't think we should move on this yet. Henry looked at her sharply. Alcott's been here 11 years, she continued. He has the trust of the field crews, the tenant farmers, and from what I can see, Mr. Caldwell's personal confidence. If we bring this to Mr. Caldwell now with what we have, the first thing Alcott will say is that the records are incomplete, that the supplier was legitimate and the correspondence was lost. And he might even be right. I can't rule it out entirely. She kept her gaze steady. I need one more thing before this goes upstairs. What thing? The receiving logs from the past 4 fall quarters, the ones kept by the storage barns. If goods were delivered and paid for, they're recorded. If no goods were delivered. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Henry nodded once. Then he stood, picked up his coffee cup, and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. You've been here 8 days, Miss Bennett. 9, Eleanor told him, counting the day I arrived. He left without smiling, but she thought she was fairly certain that he wanted to. The receiving logs took 2 days to collect. Henry obtained them quietly without alerting the land management office, which required a kind of careful maneuvering that Eleanor appreciated the difficulty of. A steward asking for records wasn't unusual. A steward asking for records from a specific set of quarters after a new records keeper had been reviewing the accounts was the kind of thing that could put a man on guard if he had reason to be guarded. Henry was, as it turned out, very good at appearing to need things for reasons other than the ones he had. Eleanor had the logs by Thursday afternoon. By Thursday evening, she had her answer. 4 of the 11 credited payments to R. Greer of Staunton corresponded to delivery dates in the receiving logs. 3 of those 4 showed quantities that were plausible, not necessarily genuine, but within the range of what a large estate might reasonably purchase. But 7 of the 11 payments had no corresponding delivery record at all. No goods received, no date of delivery, no receiving clerk's signature. Just money sent out and nothing coming in. She sat with that for a long time. 7 payments. The smallest was $42. The largest was $112. Over 4 years, the total approached $600. In 1818 in Virginia, $600 was not a minor sum. It was a year's wages for a skilled worker. It was the difference between a family losing their land and keeping it. Eleanor thought about James Alcott, who had been with the estate for 11 years and who had the trust of everyone who worked under him. She thought about the particular courage it took to steal from a man like Nathaniel Caldwell, or perhaps not courage. Perhaps just the slow, incremental erosion of principle that happened when a man started to believe he was owed something he wasn't getting. She didn't know which it was. It didn't change the numbers. She made a clean copy of her findings, precise, factual, without interpretation, beyond what the records themselves demonstrated. Then she wrote a cover note to Henry Whitaker that said simply, "I believe you'll find this sufficient. Please advise how you'd like to proceed." She slid it under his office door at 8:30 and went to bed. What she did not expect was for Nathaniel Caldwell to come to the library himself the next morning before breakfast. He arrived early enough that the household hadn't fully woken. She could hear the kitchen staff below and the distant sound of horses being fed. But the corridors were quiet, and the light through the library windows was the thin, serious kind that came before the sun had committed to the day. Eleanor had been at her desk for an hour already. She had work to do that had nothing to do with James Alcott or receiving logs. The cataloging system was nearly complete, but the cross-reference index still needed 4 more hours of careful attention, and she intended to give it those 4 hours. Nathaniel walked in, shut the door behind him, and stood with Henry Whitaker's copy of her findings in his hand. His expression was controlled in the way that strong emotion, carefully managed, looked controlled, the jaw set, the eyes carrying something that hadn't been there before, something that sat between fury and a cold, deliberate calm. Eleanor set her pen down and gave him her full attention. "Tell me how you found it," he said. Not demanding, asking. The difference was notable enough that she registered it. The pattern in the household accounts pointed to a vendor name. The vendor name matched a family connection. The receiving logs confirmed that the deliveries didn't happen. She kept it simple. Anyone looking at the full set of records together would have found it. The problem was that the records hadn't been in the same place at the same time before. Alcott's been falsifying records for 4 years. He said it quietly, like something he was still constructing the reality of. Under my roof, using my accounts. The records indicate that, yes. And you found it in? He glanced at the cover note, 9 days. I had the advantage of fresh eyes, Eleanor said. Someone who has looked at the same records for years stops seeing the anomalies. They become part of the landscape. Nathaniel set the papers down on the far end of her work table. He moved toward the window, not to look out, she thought, but simply to be in motion, because stillness at this moment would cost too much. I trusted that man, he said. Eleanor didn't offer a comfortable response. There wasn't one, and offering false comfort to a man like Nathaniel Caldwell would have been both ineffective and condescending. Trust is a reasonable thing to extend to someone who has given you 11 years of service, she said. He was careful. He waited for the right quarters, used plausible amounts, chose a supplier name that would pass a surface inspection. This wasn't a moment of desperation, it was a plan. She paused. That doesn't make it less of a betrayal. It makes it a colder one. Nathaniel turned from the window. He looked at her with an expression she'd have been hard-pressed to name, not exactly gratitude, not exactly recognition. Something between the two. What would you recommend? He asked. That stopped her, if only for a beat. In 9 days, not a single person in this household had asked her what she recommended about anything beyond where to file a document. She answered carefully. Have a solicitor review the records before you confront him. Protect the legal standing of the evidence. Then confront him privately with Henry present, not publicly, not in front of the field crews. Whatever Alcott has done, his workers respect him, and humiliating him publicly will damage the estate's standing with the tenant farmers more than it will satisfy justice. She folded her hands on the table. If you want recovery of the funds, that's a legal matter, and it may or may not succeed. If you want this to stop, and you want the right record established, the quiet route is more effective. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. You've thought about this considerably. I've had 9 days with nothing but records and patterns, she told him. Thinking is what I do in the spaces between. Something shifted in his face, a small involuntary thing there and gone. Miss Bennett. He picked up her cover note. When Henry told me last autumn that he intended to hire a records keeper, I told him to hire a clerk from Richmond. He said the best candidate was a minister's daughter from Culpeper, who'd never held a formal position in household management. He paused. I told him I doubted she'd last the week. Eleanor held very still. I heard, she said evenly. I know you heard. He met her gaze without looking away. I said it without concern for whether you heard it, which was... He stopped. He was not. She had come to understand a man who apologized easily or often. The word seemed to require a particular structural effort from him, which was poorly done. Eleanor let the silence hold for a moment. Not to punish him, she wasn't interested in punishment, but because some things deserved the weight of their own silence. I appreciate you saying so, she said at last. He nodded once. Then he picked up her compiled report and left. James Alcott was gone from Caldwell Estate by the following Monday, Eleanor did not witness the conversation she was not meant to, and she hadn't expected to be. She knew it had happened because the land management office was quiet for 2 days, in a way that it hadn't been before, because Henry Whitaker moved through the household with the particular purposefulness of a man who has resolved something costly, and because Clara the housemaid appeared at Eleanor's library door on Tuesday morning with slightly wider eyes than usual. "Mr. Alcott's left, miss," Clara told her in a carefully quiet voice. "Nobody's saying much about why." "That's probably wise," Eleanor said. Clara hovered. "Cook says he's been let go for mismanagement. That's what everyone's being told." The girl's eyes were sharp with the particular intelligence of someone who spent their days moving through a house unnoticed. "But it was more than that, wasn't it?" Eleanor looked at her steadily. "It's not my place to speak to that," she said. "And it's not to your benefit to speculate, Clara. Let the official explanation stand and go about your work. That's the kindest thing you can do for the people on those field crews who respected him." Clara thought about that. Then she nodded in the way she'd been nodding since the first evening, the kind of nod that meant she'd genuinely heard something. "Yes, miss." The door closed, and Eleanor turned back to her cross-reference index, and the household of Caldwell Estate moved forward into the week, and James Alcott's name was not spoken again, at least not where Eleanor could hear it. What followed was something she hadn't anticipated: a shift in the texture of the house itself. Not warmth exactly. Not welcome. Something more structural than that. Henry Whitaker began consulting her on matters that went beyond the library, not formally, not with any acknowledgement that he was doing it, but in the quiet way of a practical man who had identified a useful mind and intended to use it. He would appear in her doorway with a question framed as general inquiry: "Miss Bennett, in your review of the records, did you happen to notice anything about the standing arrangement with the Millers Creek tenants? Or I don't suppose you've seen the original boundary agreement for the Southfield. There seems to be a discrepancy." She noticed the questions, and she answered them, and she did not draw attention to the fact that what Henry was doing was in effect making her an informal advisor on estate matters that went considerably beyond the scope of her employment. She was a records keeper. She was being asked for the judgment of someone considerably more. She was careful not to let this show on her face or change her conduct. To act as though the additional trust entitled her to additional standing would be to misread it, and misreading the dynamics of a household was the kind of error that could unravel everything she'd quietly built in 2 weeks. Robert the footman had stopped testing her. He carried her materials without being asked now, and occasionally held doors with a respect that was no longer grudging. The cook had started sending an extra cup of tea to the library in the mid-morning unprompted. Small things. She did not make too much of them. The larger difficulty was something she couldn't resolve by cataloging or careful thinking. Victoria Ashford was still at Caldwell Estate. She was there for nearly 2 weeks, and in that time, Eleanor observed her with the attention of someone who understood that observation was her most reliable tool. Victoria was not cruel. This was the first thing Eleanor established, and she held it firmly against any temptation to conclude otherwise. Victoria Ashford was intelligent, well-mannered, socially adept, and genuinely kind to the household staff in the casual, unconscious way of a woman who had been raised to believe that a person's treatment of those beneath them in station was a measure of their character. She treated Eleanor with unfailing politeness and what appeared to be genuine respect. She was also clearly the future of Caldwell Estate in the minds of everyone who lived in it. Eleanor did not allow herself to dwell on what she felt about that. Or rather, she allowed herself exactly the acknowledgement necessary for honesty, and not a moment more. She was a records keeper in a house where she had no family connections, no social standing, and no claim on the future of any kind beyond the work she did today. Victoria Ashford was a judge's daughter who moved through the world with the particular ease of someone whose place in it had never been in question. These were simply facts. Facts could be lived with. What Eleanor had not anticipated was Victoria herself seeking her out. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks into Eleanor's tenure. Eleanor was in the library working on the final section of the cross-reference index. The door opened, and she expected Henry, or possibly Clara, with another carefully indirect observation about the household, and instead found Victoria Ashford standing in the entrance with 2 cups of tea and an expression that managed to be both gracious and slightly uncertain. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Victoria set one cup on the edge of the work table. I find myself at loose ends this afternoon, and I thought... She glanced at the organized spread of Eleanor's work. I confess I'm curious about what you actually do in here. Eleanor considered several responses and chose the honest one. Currently, I'm completing a cross-reference index for the estate's land records, she said. It means that anyone looking for documents relating to a particular parcel of land can find them regardless of the date or type of document, without needing to know Mr. Forsyth's particular system. Victoria looked at the index pages with genuine interest. Henry says you found the error in the accounts in 9 days. The irregularity, Eleanor said carefully. 9 days, yes. Victoria sat down in the chair across the work table, not as a visiting member of the family, condescending to share space with a servant, but as one person settling in to talk to another. Eleanor noticed the distinction. I've known Nathaniel for most of my adult life, Victoria said, wrapping her hands around her teacup. He is a... She paused, appearing to choose her words with some care of her own. He's a man who forms his opinions quickly and doesn't revise them easily. He takes that as a virtue. Eleanor said nothing. She waited. He told me the evening I arrived that you'd probably be gone within the week. Victoria's gray eyes were steady and thoughtful. I think you may be the first person in a considerable while who has done something he didn't expect. I simply did the work that was needed, Eleanor said. Yes. Victoria looked at her with an expression that was harder to read than most of hers, something careful in it, something that was considering a question she hadn't yet asked. That's what makes it unexpected. He expected you to struggle, or to try to impress him, or to leave. He didn't expect you to simply work, as though his opinion of the outcome was not a relevant factor. Eleanor turned her pen over in her fingers once. His opinion of the outcome, she said quietly, doesn't change what the work requires. Victoria was silent for a moment. Then she said, No, I don't suppose it does. She finished her tea. She thanked Eleanor for the conversation, which was a gracious way of describing what had really been an extended and careful observation of another woman, and she left. Eleanor sat very still for a moment after the door closed. She understood that she had just been evaluated by a woman with considerably more social intelligence than her age might suggest, and she was not entirely certain what conclusion had been reached. She picked up her pen and went back to the index. The moment that changed things happened the following Saturday, and it happened in front of people. Nathaniel had called for a review of the estate's current land agreements, a quarterly meeting that typically involved himself, Henry Whitaker, the land manager, and any relevant documentation. With Alcott gone, the land management duties had been temporarily absorbed by Henry, and Henry had asked Eleanor to prepare the relevant records for the meeting and to be present to locate any additional documentation that might be requested. She was not a participant in the meeting. She was there as reference a library function. She sat at the side table with the organized files and waited to be asked for things. The meeting was attended by Nathaniel Henry and 2 men who had ridden from Richmond, a solicitor named Greenfield, and a man introduced as Mr. Asa Prewitt, who represented the interests of a neighboring property owner named Hartley in a boundary matter that had apparently been simmering for some time. Prewitt was a man with the compact, spring-loaded energy of someone who made his living from disagreements. He had a sheaf of documents and the confidence of a person who believed he was the only one in the room who'd done his preparation. The boundary matter concerned a strip of land along the eastern edge of the Caldwell property, approximately 30 acres, that had been a subject of informal dispute for 15 years. The Hartley family had made a formal claim. Greenfield had prepared a response. The meeting was to review the response before it was filed. Eleanor listened without speaking. She pulled documents when Henry requested them. She organized the relevant survey maps in order of date and set them within Nathaniel's reach. She was, to all appearances, a well-organized piece of furniture. Then Prewitt laid out his central argument, which was that the original 1803 survey, the one that established the Caldwell eastern boundary, contained a notation error that, properly interpreted, moved the boundary line 30 feet west of where Caldwell claimed it stood. Greenfield began to respond. Nathaniel listened. Eleanor found herself looking at the survey map in front of her, which she had reviewed 2 days ago in the course of completing the index, and she noticed something that she sat with for exactly 30 seconds before she made a decision. Excuse me. Every head in the room turned. She kept her voice measured. She was aware acutely of what she was doing, a records keeper interrupting a meeting of men to offer an opinion on a legal matter. She was also aware that the alternative was to watch Caldwell Estate potentially lose 30 acres of productive land over a misreading she could correct in 45 seconds. I apologize for the interruption. She addressed herself to Nathaniel because that was the correct protocol. The 1803 survey, Mr. Pruitt is referencing the boundary notation in the lower left quadrant. If I may. Nathaniel's eyes were unreadable. He nodded once. Eleanor brought the survey to the table. She laid it flat. She pointed without touching to the notation in question. The notation reads 42 chains east to the drainage creek. Mr. Pruitt is reading 42 chains as the distance from the stake marker. But the survey notation convention used by this particular surveyor. She reached to the file, withdrew a second survey from 1799, the one she'd cross-referenced 2 days ago. Uses chains from the property center, not from the stake. The same notation appears here in the 1799 survey for the north boundary, and it's confirmed in the county record as placing the line at precisely where Caldwell claims. Silence. Pruitt stared at the two surveys. Greenfield leaned forward reading. Henry Whitaker across the table had the expression of a man watching someone disarm something dangerous with a hatpin. Pruitt looked up at Eleanor, and there was a particular quality to how he looked at her, the look of a man recalculating something he'd been certain of. "Where did you get the 1799 survey?" he asked. "The estate records. It's been there for 19 years. She kept her voice entirely pleasant. "I catalogued it last Tuesday." The meeting required another hour after that, but the shape of it had changed entirely. Greenfield incorporated the 1799 survey into the Caldwell response on the spot, which made it considerably more formidable than it had been walking in. Pruitt's spring-loaded energy lost some of its compression. Nathaniel said very little. When Pruitt and Greenfield left, Henry quietly gathered the documents. Nathaniel stood at the table and looked at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, or rather, one she hadn't seen directed at her. It was the expression of a man who was revising something and finding the revision uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the legal matter. "That survey," he said. "You catalogued it on Tuesday." "Yes." "And you recognize the notation convention." "I'd seen it twice in the index already. It's distinctive. Most surveyors in this region use a different method." "You weren't asked to be at this meeting for your opinion." He said it flatly without hostility. It was simply true. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I wasn't." "Why did you speak?" She looked at him directly. "Because 30 acres of your eastern field was about to be conceded to a misreading, and I was the only person in the room who'd seen the 1799 survey. Staying quiet because I wasn't invited to have an opinion would have been a very elegant form of uselessness." Something moved across Nathaniel Caldwell's face. It moved too quickly for her to catalog faster than she could have named it, but she felt it the way you feel a shift in temperature without being able to say precisely when the warmth began. He didn't respond to that. He picked up his coat from the chair back, straightened it, and walked toward the door. At the doorway, he stopped. He didn't turn around entirely. "Miss Bennett," he said, and his voice had dropped a register quieter, less the tone of an employer and more the tone of a man, saying something he hadn't entirely planned to say. "The Harlan deed, the accounts, the survey notation." A pause. "I don't imagine it's coincidence." "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't. You came here to manage a library. I came here to do what was needed." She kept her hands folded on the table. The library needed managing. The accounts needed examination. The survey needed a second set of eyes. You could have left any one of those to someone else. "I could have," she said. "I didn't." He stood in the doorway for a moment that felt slightly longer than all the previous moments in this room. Then he was gone, and Eleanor was left in the library with the surveys and the index and the quiet that followed the departure of something that had not entirely resolved itself. She pulled the cross-reference index toward her. She picked up her pen. She made the next entry in a careful, even hand. The afternoon light moved across the floorboards. The house settled around her with all its records and its land and its complicated history, and Eleanor Bennett sat in the middle of it and did her work, and thought quietly that something had just shifted. Not the land, not the records, not the legal question. Something else smaller and harder to catalog. She was not ready to give it a name. The invitations for the Caldwell Autumn Gathering had gone out 3 weeks before Eleanor arrived at the estate, which meant the event had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the particular machinery of Virginia society that ran on its own schedule, regardless of what happened inside any given household. Nathaniel hosted it every October, had done so for 12 years since he'd taken formal ownership of the estate at 25. Henry had mentioned it in passing during their first account review. The way you mentioned weather, something coming that required preparation, not something that could be reasoned with. Eleanor had noted it and returned to the index. Now the index was complete. Alcott was gone. The boundary survey had been filed with the county clerk and the gathering was 4 days away. The household had reorganized itself entirely around the fact of it, which meant Eleanor's work had reorganized itself too. Henry needed the formal record of estate landholdings, prepared for any guest who might inquire. The household accounts needed to be current to the day, and 3 years of correspondence with neighboring families required indexing, so that Nathaniel would not be caught not remembering a detail that a Virginia gentleman was expected to remember. Eleanor worked. This was what she did when things around her were uncertain. She worked, and the work held her steady, and steadiness was what she had, instead of the things she didn't have. She was at her desk before 7 every morning. She was there past 9 most evenings. Clara brought tea without being asked. Henry appeared and disappeared with the efficiency of a man who had 3 men's worth of tasks and exactly 1 man's worth of time. Robert carried things and stopped talking, which Eleanor had come to understand was his version of reliability. On the second evening before the gathering, Victoria Ashford came to the library again. This time, she didn't bring tea. She sat down across from Eleanor with her hands in her lap and the look of a woman who had decided to say something and was organizing the approach. "There will be people at the gathering," Victoria began carefully, "who will want to know who you are." Eleanor set down her pen. "Not out of genuine interest," Victoria continued. "Out of the particular kind of interest that Virginia society takes in people who don't quite fit its existing categories. A minister's daughter from Culpeper, employed at the Caldwell Estate as a records keeper, who has apparently managed to become indispensable in under 3 weeks." She folded her hands. "That is the kind of story people tell to one another across a dinner table." "I imagine it is," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you because I think you should be prepared." Victoria's voice was even and not unkind. "Some of them will be rude about it. Not openly, that's not how it's done here. They'll be curious in a way that's meant to diminish. They'll ask questions that sound like interest and are actually designed to remind you of your position." Eleanor looked at her steadily. "Miss Ashford." She kept her voice quiet. "I was raised in a parish house in Culpeper County. I have been navigating the particular politeness of people who mean to diminish me since I was old enough to pour tea. I appreciate the warning. Truly." A pause. "But I reckon I know the shape of that conversation." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her composed face relaxed just slightly, the way a held breath releases. "Yes," Victoria said. "I expect you do." She smoothed her skirt and moved toward the door. At the doorway she paused, and Eleanor thought she was going to say something about Nathaniel. She had the sense that Victoria had been orbiting that subject for several days without landing. But instead she said, "The blue dress if you have one. Not because it's required, because it will serve you better than gray in that room." She left before Eleanor could respond. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Then she reached for her pen, finished the entry she'd been working on, and thought about the blue dress. The one decent one she had cotton lawn rather than silk, but well made and clean folded at the bottom of her trunk. She thought, well then. The gathering arrived on a Saturday evening, with the weight of something that had been anticipated too long. By 4 o'clock, The house had transformed in the small but significant ways that distinguished an occasion from an ordinary day. The candles lit early, the good linens out, the sound of horses in the drive, beginning a full hour before guests were expected. Eleanor was not a guest. She understood this clearly. She had been asked by Henry to be available in the library for the first portion of the evening, in case any documentation was needed, and to use her judgment about when her presence was no longer useful. That was the word Henry used, useful. She had long since stopped being bothered by it. She was at her desk in the library, with the estate's current landholding summary, and the indexed correspondence files within reach, and she stayed there while the gathering assembled in the rooms beyond. She could hear voices, the particular acoustic of a room filling with people who all knew one another, the overlapping sound of families and alliances and histories that stretched back generations. Virginia society at this level was not a collection of individuals. It was a network, and the network had its own memory, and the memory was long. She had been at the desk for an hour and a half when Henry appeared at the door with an expression that had gone careful in a specific way she'd learned to read. "There's a matter," he said. She looked up. "Mr. Caldwell's been informed that the Prewitt family is questioning the validity of the boundary filing." Henry kept his voice low. "Not the survey. They're not contesting the survey now that it's been filed with both documents. They're questioning the authority of the filing itself. Their solicitor is suggesting that the 1803 deed contains a transfer clause that limits Caldwell's unilateral right to enter into boundary agreements without co-signature from the Hartley family." Eleanor was already reaching for the deed file. "What's the clause number?" "I don't know," Nathaniel's asking. She had the 1803 deed in her hands in under a minute. She knew exactly where it was, because she had cataloged it herself, and the index was organized precisely for moments like this one. She opened it, moved through the formal language with the speed of someone who had read enough of these documents to know where the relevant sections lived. The transfer clause was in Section 7. She read it twice. "This clause," she said quietly, "applies to transfers of the property itself, not to boundary agreements within an existing holding. The Prewitt solicitor is reading transfer as encompassing all legal actions related to the land, but that's not what the language says. Transfer here means conveyance of title." She looked up at Henry. "Tell Mr. Caldwell Section 7 second paragraph, the operative word is convey. A boundary filing is not a conveyance." Henry's eyes moved to the deed. He read the section. She indicated, his lips moving slightly. Then he looked at her. "Come," he said. "That's not Henry. I'm not dressed for Miss Bennett." His voice was firm and not unkind. "Come." She followed Henry through the corridor and into the outer parlor, which connected to the main gathering room and was currently occupied by Nathaniel and two other men, one of whom she recognized as Greenfield, the Caldwell solicitor, and one who had the bearing of a man accustomed to winning arguments by volume rather than accuracy. The volume of voices from the gathering beyond filtered through the closed door. Nathaniel saw her before she finished entering the room. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition, as if he'd been waiting for a particular person to arrive and hadn't known it until they did. "Miss Bennett." He gestured her forward. "Greenfield, this is Eleanor Bennett, our records keeper. She's reviewed the 1803 deed." Greenfield nodded. He recognized her from the boundary meeting. The third man, who had the close-set eyes and defensive posture of someone whose argument was beginning to develop structural doubts, looked at her and then looked back at Nathaniel with an expression that said plainly, "You are proposing to address a legal question with your records keeper." Eleanor set the deed on the side table and opened it to Section 7. "The transfer clause," she said, addressing herself to Greenfield, because he was the solicitor and the question was legal. "Uses the word convey in the second paragraph and consistent with its use elsewhere in Virginia. Deed law of this period convey refers specifically to the transfer of property title. A boundary agreement is not a conveyance, it's a clarification of an existing boundary. The Hartley co-signature requirement, if the clause were read to apply, would only be triggered by an action that transferred ownership." She kept her voice steady, factual, completely without heat. "I can pull 3 additional deeds from this estate's records that use the same language in the same context if you need the comparison." The third man said, in a voice that managed to be both dismissive and uncertain. "This is hardly—" "She's right." Greenfield said it without hesitation. He was reading the clause, his finger moving along the line. "The operative word is convey. I should have caught this when Prewitt raised it." He looked up. "You're correct, Miss Bennett. This is not a transfer action." A beat of silence. Nathaniel looked at the third man. "Tell Prewitt's solicitor," Nathaniel said very quietly, "that the clause has been reviewed and the filing stands." The man left without further argument. He left quickly, which was its own kind of answer. Greenfield gathered his papers, exchanged a few words with Nathaniel that Eleanor didn't catch, and departed. Henry slipped out behind him, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel alone in the outer parlor, with the muffled sound of Virginia society moving around them on the other side of the door. Nathaniel looked at her. He looked at her for long enough that Eleanor became aware of the particular quality of his attention. Not the assessment he'd given her in the first days, the calibration of a man deciding what category to put her in. This was something different. This was the look of a man who had stopped categorizing and started actually seeing. "That's the third time," he said. "The Harlan deed," she said. "The accounts. And now the transfer clause." "Yes." He moved to the window, not looking out. She had learned this was what he did when he was thinking, and didn't want it to be visible. "Each one would have cost me something. The deed disorganization wasted time. The accounts $600, and the continued erosion of funds I wasn't watching. The boundary filing." He stopped. If Prewitt's claim had stood, the 30 acres would have been in litigation for another decade. The legal costs alone. "I know," Eleanor said. "I paid you to manage a library." "Yes." He turned from the window. "What do you want, Miss Bennett?" The question came out direct without softening. "Not here, I mean in general. What is it you're actually after?" She'd been asked this before in various forms, by people who meant it as a diminishment. The implication being that a woman of her position, who was clearly capable of more than her position required, must be after something she wasn't entitled to. She had heard the question shaped that way so many times that she'd developed a reflex for deflecting it. She didn't deflect now. "I want to do work that matters," she said plainly. "I want to be paid fairly for it. I want a room that's mine, and enough security to sleep in it without counting how many months I can afford to remain somewhere before I have to find somewhere else." She held his gaze without apology. "I want to be of genuine use to people who will actually be served by what I can do, not as a charity, as a function." Nathaniel absorbed this. "That's a modest list," he said, but not unkindly. "It's an honest one," Eleanor told him. "I reckon they're not always the same thing." Something happened in his face, small and quick, but there. The door from the gathering room opened, and a woman appeared in the entrance. Tall, handsome, with the particular confidence of old Virginia money, and her gaze swept the room and landed on Nathaniel with a smile that was perfectly calibrated. "Nathaniel darling, the Haversham family has been asking after you, and I see you've been attending to business." Her eyes moved to Eleanor with the kind of assessment that was designed to be invisible, and was never actually invisible to the person being assessed. "How industrious." "Mrs. Cartwright." Nathaniel's voice shifted back to its public register. "Miss Bennett has been assisting with some estate documentation." "How helpful." Mrs. Cartwright's smile did not change. "Do run along, dear. I'm sure the records will keep." The words were pleasant. Their purpose was not. Eleanor closed the deed, tucked it under her arm, and looked at Mrs. Cartwright with an expression that offered nothing to react to. "Of course," she said easily. "Good evening, ma'am." She left. She walked back down the corridor to the library, with her spine at exactly the angle it had been all evening, set the deed back in its correct folder in the index, and sat down at her desk. She allowed herself 30 seconds of simply breathing. Then she picked up her pen. She was not ashamed. She was not diminished. She was, if anything, very clear on what this world was, on what her place in it was not, and on the distinction between a woman who endured a room and a woman who simply didn't need anything that room had to offer. She was still there when the gathering began to wind down 2 hours later. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the sound in the corridor changed. Not the departure of guests, not the clearing of the main rooms, but something else. something that had the quality of an unexpected development. She heard Henry's voice quick and low, and another voice she didn't immediately recognize, and then Nathaniel's, and then footsteps that came toward the library with more urgency than an October gathering warranted. Henry came through the door first, and she read his face before he opened his mouth. "There's a problem," he said. She was already standing. The problem was this. Thomas Hayward, one of the neighboring landowners, and a guest of the evening, had come to Nathaniel with a document. Not a threat exactly. Hayward was too careful for open threats, but a paper that he had produced from his coat pocket, with the deliberate timing of a man who had been carrying it all evening, waiting for the right moment. It was a letter dated September of that year, signed with a name Eleanor didn't know, a name that turned out as Henry laid out the situation in the library doorway, while Nathaniel stood just behind him, with an expression carved from something very cold, to belong to a merchant in Charlottesville, who was claiming that Caldwell Estate had defaulted on a payment agreement for timber supplied the previous spring. $460, Henry said. He's claiming the payment was never made. Was it? Eleanor asked. I believe it was, Henry said. I authorized the payment myself, but I can't find the receipt. Eleanor was already at the filing cabinet. What was the merchant's name? Dawson. Edmund Dawson, Timber, Charlottesville. Quarter or spring, April or May. April or... She was moving through the spring quarter vendor payments with the speed of someone who had organized these files herself and knew exactly how they were ordered. April, the D section. Dawson, E. She found the folder in under 2 minutes, pulled it, opened it, and stopped. The folder was there. The label was correct. The folder was empty. Not misfiled empty. The receipt was gone. She looked at Henry. Henry looked at the folder. Nathaniel stepped into the room. The receipt isn't there, Eleanor said. Could it have been misfiled? She was already checking the adjacent folders. Everything around Dawson in the spring quarter. The miscellaneous vendor file, the general receipts stack. Nothing. She went to the cross-reference index, her own index, the one she'd built over 3 weeks, and checked the entry for Dawson, which she had made herself from the existing records when she cataloged them. The entry was there. She'd recorded it when she cataloged the folder. On October 21st, the Dawson receipt had been in that folder. She had held it in her hands. She looked at Nathaniel. When I cataloged this folder, she said, the receipt was here. I recorded it in the index on October 21st. She showed him the index entry, her own handwriting, the date, the document description, the filing location. It's been removed since then. The room was very quiet. Henry said slowly, Who has had access to these files since October 21st? The list was not long. Eleanor, Henry, Robert, who carried materials but didn't handle documents, Nathaniel himself on 2 occasions, and one other person. She had been precise about this because she was precise about everything. A person who had come to the library 3 days ago asking about the spring quarter correspondence, saying they were looking for a letter related to a social engagement. A person who had been alone in the library for approximately 15 minutes while Eleanor was at lunch. Eleanor did not say the name. She looked at Henry, and Henry looked at her, and the same name crossed both their minds at the same time, and neither of them put it in the air. Nathaniel read their faces. Who? He said. Not a question. A demand. Henry glanced at Eleanor. Eleanor took a breath. I need to be careful, she said precisely, because I have circumstantial evidence and not direct evidence. And the person I'm about to mention is someone whose character I have not found any other reason to question. She kept her gaze level. 3 days ago, Mr. Hayward's secretary came to the library asking about the spring quarter correspondence. He was alone here for 15 minutes. The receipt was in this folder when he arrived. I cannot say with certainty that he took it. A pause. But I can say I have no other explanation for its absence. Nathaniel's jaw was a hard line. Hayward's secretary. He said the name of the man, a young man named Fenwick, who Eleanor had seen twice and thought nothing of. Hayward sent his secretary to remove the receipt, a default claim at my own gathering. Henry said very quietly. That would mean Dawson is in it too. He wouldn't file a false claim without... He might, Nathaniel said, clipped and cold, if someone offered him enough to make the trouble worthwhile. He looked at Eleanor. Can you reconstruct the receipt? Is there any other record of the payment? She was already thinking. The payment would appear in the household account as an outgoing sum. If the amount matches Hayward's claim that establishes the payment was made, and if Dawson received the payment, she paused. Does Dawson use a bank in Charlottesville? I don't know. If he does, the deposit would appear in his account. A credible solicitor could subpoena those records if it came to litigation. She set the empty folder down. But it doesn't need to come to litigation if we can establish the payment through the accounts tonight and put that in front of Hayward before he leaves. Nathaniel stared at her for a moment. Can you do that in... He looked toward the corridor, calculated 30 minutes. Hayward is still here. I can do it in 20, Eleanor said, and she was already reaching for the account ledgers. She found the outgoing payment in 11 minutes. April 14th, $460 payable to E. Dawson Timber Supply, Charlottesville. The entry was in Henry's handwriting. He had authorized it himself exactly as he'd said, and it matched the claimed amount to the dollar. She copied the account entry in a clear hand on a fresh sheet, noted the ledger volume and page, and handed it to Henry with 3 minutes to spare. This establishes the payment was made, she said. It doesn't prove Dawson received it, but it puts the burden back on Hayward to explain why he's presenting a default claim on a debt that appears in our accounts as settled. He'll have to produce Dawson directly, and if Dawson received the money, which he almost certainly did, because this amount left this estate, Dawson will not want to be in a room with a solicitor explaining the discrepancy. Henry took the paper. He looked at it, and then he looked at Eleanor with something she had never quite seen in his face before. Something that sat between professional respect and something older and harder to name. Stay here, he said. He went. Nathaniel stayed. Eleanor stood by the work table with her hands at her sides and waited. The sounds from the outer rooms had quieted considerably. Most guests had gone, and the remaining ones were in the late evening configuration of a gathering winding toward its end. You're very calm, Nathaniel said. I'm not particularly. She kept her eyes on the doorway. But being visibly upset won't help recover the receipt or address Hayward, and those are the things that actually need doing. The receipt was stolen from your files. Yes. From records you spent 3 weeks organizing. Yes. She turned to look at him. That's an irritating fact, but it's not the most important one. The most important one is whether we can stop a fraudulent claim from costing you $460 and whatever litigation would follow. The filing system can be improved. She paused. I should have kept a second record of the receipts in a separate location. I'll do that going forward. Nathaniel looked at her as though she'd said something that surprised him, which seemed to happen with some regularity lately. The problem happens, he said slowly, and your first thought is how to prevent it next time. My first thought was finding the ledger entry, she said. But yes, after that. He was quiet for a long moment. 11 years ago, he said, and his voice had changed, quieter, stripped of the formal register. My father died and left me this estate with 3 mortgages. I didn't know about a household staff that was owed 4 months of wages, and a land manager, the one before Alcott, who had already been quietly selling timber rights for 2 years. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance in the way of someone reporting something they'd learned to carry. I was 25. I spent the first 2 years of owning Caldwell simply keeping it alive. I swore after that I would know everything that happened on this land. Everything. A pause. And Alcott stole from me for 4 years under my own roof. And Hayward has just walked into my gathering with a forged claim. Eleanor waited. I don't like, he said carefully, what that says about how much I knew. It says you trusted people who use that trust to their advantage, she said quietly. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's the particular vulnerability of a man who has enough to manage that he can't watch everything at once. He turned to look at her. You watch everything, he said. I watch the records, she said. It's easier to watch everything when everything you're watching is on paper. Something, she couldn't quite call it a smile, but something adjacent moved across his face. Henry came back at that moment, which was perhaps just as well, Because Eleanor thought the next 30 seconds might have been a different kind of moment entirely, and she wasn't ready to know what kind. "Hayward's gone," Henry said. He took the account copy, read it, went pale, and left with his secretary and no further conversation. He set his hands on the back of a chair. "I don't think we'll hear from Dawson." Nathaniel let out a breath that had been held for a while. "Good," he said. And then, after a pause, looking not at Henry, "Very good." The gathering finished its departure, and the house settled into its late-night quiet, and Eleanor remained in the library longer than she'd needed to putting the files back in order, with the particular thoroughness of someone restoring something that had been deliberately disturbed. She was nearly finished when she heard footsteps in the corridor. Not Henry's measured tread, not Clara's quick, soft step. These were slower, deliberate. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He had removed his formal coat. He was carrying 2 cups of something that steamed, and he looked for the first time since she had come to this house like a man who was not performing anything. He set one of the cups on her work table. "Coffee," he said. "Henry claims you don't sleep until the work is done." Eleanor looked at the cup and then at him. "Henry is not wrong," she said. He stayed in the doorway, both hands around his own cup, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her all evening. That new way. The one that wasn't the window assessment, wasn't the employer, measuring an employee, wasn't any of the categories she'd fit into when she first arrived. "Miss Bennett." His voice was quiet in the way that the house was quiet, not empty, but settled. "I owe you an accounting." She waited. "When I said you wouldn't last 7 days, I meant it." He didn't look away. "I looked at you, and I saw a minister's daughter with no family connections, and no reason to stay somewhere that would not be easy for her, and I calculated accordingly. I was—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I was measuring you by what you lacked instead of what you were, and that was—" He stopped again. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Poorly done," she said softly, using his own words back to him. Something cracked open in his face just slightly, just for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Poorly done." The fire in the grate shifted. The house breathed around them. Eleanor picked up the coffee cup. It was good coffee, better than the tea Clara brought, and she'd thought that was quite good. She thought about 7 days, and about 9 days, and about 3 weeks of records and receipts and survey notations, and a man who had begun to look at her and actually see her. She thought about what Victoria had said, he forms opinions quickly and doesn't revise them easily, and she thought that revising slowly when you finally did it was perhaps worth more than having been right the first time. "The work isn't done," she said at last. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It isn't." "Then I'll finish it," she told him, and turned back to the files, and heard him stay in the doorway for another long moment before the house settled back into its quiet, and she was alone again with the records and the coffee, and the particular steady warmth of knowing exactly who she was. The morning after the gathering. Caldwell Estate had the particular quiet of a house that has been through something and is still deciding what it means. Eleanor was at her desk by 6:30. She had slept 4 hours, which was enough. She had learned to function on less during the years after her father died, when the work of settling his affairs and then finding employment had left little room for anything as impractical as adequate rest. The coffee from the night before sat in her memory with a specificity she was careful not to examine too closely. She reached for the pen, opened the index, and went to work. By 8 o'clock, she had implemented the secondary receipt log she'd mentioned to Nathaniel, a parallel record kept in a separate locked drawer of every financial document that passed through the library. She designed it in 40 minutes, transferred the existing records into it in another hour, and locked the drawer with the small key she added to the ring she kept on her person. If someone wanted to remove a document from the files in the future, they would still have the index entry and the secondary log as evidence of its existence. Removing a document would no longer erase it from the record. It would only make its absence visible. She was satisfied with this. In the straightforward way, she was satisfied with any problem properly solved. Henry arrived at 9:30 and stopped in the doorway when he saw the secondary log. "That's new," he said. "Last night demonstrated a gap in the system. I closed it." She didn't look up from the entry she was completing. "The key is mine. If you need access, I'll open it for you directly. I'd prefer it not be duplicated." Henry looked at the locked drawer, then at her, and his mouth did something that was almost a smile. "You're already thinking about next time." "I'm always thinking about next time," she told him. "That's the only way the filing system does what it's supposed to do." Henry pulled the door mostly closed and came further into the room. His face had shifted into its more serious configuration. "Hayward sent a note this morning," he said. "No further claim, no explanation, no apology, just a withdrawal of the matter. One sentence." "That's what I expected," Eleanor said. "It's also confirmation that Fenwick took the receipt. Because if the claim had been legitimate, if Dawson had genuinely not received payment, Hayward wouldn't withdraw on the basis of an account entry alone. He'd demand bank records, solicitor review arbitration." Henry set his hands on the back of the chair across from her. He withdrew because he knows what the bank records would show. "Yes." Eleanor set down her pen. "What do you intend to do about it?" Henry was quiet for a moment. "That's Mr. Caldwell's decision." "Of course. But what do you think he'll do?" Henry studied the desk between them for a moment. The organized surface of it. The neat stacks, the index that she had built from disorder over 3 weeks. "I think," he said slowly, "that Nathaniel Caldwell does not forget. He doesn't make loud decisions about it. He simply adjusts his understanding of who a man is and behaves accordingly going forward." He paused. "Hayward will find future dealings with this estate considerably colder, and Fenwick will never work in a Virginia household again, not one that matters." "That's a quiet form of consequences," Eleanor observed. "It's a Virginia form," Henry said, "which is usually the most permanent kind." She thought about the long memory of a network that didn't need courts or public confrontation to ruin a man's prospects. She thought about Alcott, who had left quietly and would not be recommended anywhere. She thought about what it meant to operate in a world where reputation was currency and the bank was always open. Then she thought about what it meant that she had been the one to stop both threats. She picked up her pen again. "Henry." She kept her eyes on the page. "Am I still employed as a records keeper?" The question was direct enough that it startled him. She could hear the small shift in his breathing. "Of course you are. Why would you?" "Because the scope of what I've been doing," she said carefully, "is considerably beyond what a records keeper does. I've been acting as an account auditor, a legal research assistant, and apparently an informal advisor on estate matters. I've been doing all of that on a records keeper's arrangement." She looked up then. "I don't raise this as a complaint. I raise it because the arrangement should accurately reflect the work, and right now it doesn't." Henry opened his mouth, then he closed it. "That's a conversation," he said at last, "for Mr. Caldwell." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you first because I think it's the correct order of things, and because I want your honest opinion of whether I'm overstepping." Henry looked at her for a long, considering moment. "You're not overstepping," he said. "You're stating a fact." She nodded once and went back to the index, and Henry left to speak with Nathaniel, and Eleanor sat with the quiet knowledge that she had just done something that could go badly. That a woman in her position asking for her arrangement to be reconsidered was a woman taking a risk, and that she had done it anyway, because she knew with the same certainty with which she knew the difference between a conveyance clause and a boundary agreement that she was right. Nathaniel came to the library himself that afternoon. He didn't send a message through Henry or a note through Clara. He came himself, which Eleanor had learned to understand as a marker. Nathaniel Caldwell came himself when the matter was one he considered serious enough to require his direct attention rather than his delegation. He walked in, closed the door, and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, in that posture she'd catalogued weeks ago as his thinking stance. The one that meant he was about to say something he'd already decided on, but was still composing the delivery of. "Henry tells me you've raised a question about your arrangement," he began. "I have." She kept her hands flat on the table. "I want to be clear, I'm not asking for anything I haven't earned. I'm asking that what I've earned be named accurately." "What do you think you've earned?" She looked at him steadily. "A title that reflects the actual work. Records keeper is accurate for the library management which I intend to continue. It doesn't cover account review, legal document analysis, or estate advisory functions. Those are different categories of work, and in any other household, they would carry different compensation and different standing. She paused. I'm not asking for either of those things today. I'm asking for the title to be corrected, because the title is what determines how people in this household and outside it understand what I am here. The room held the particular quality of a moment being decided. Nathaniel looked at her, not the window look, not the assessing look, but the new one, the one she still didn't have a complete name for. Estate administrator, he said. That's the accurate title for what you're doing. Eleanor held very still. That is a significant change from records keeper, she said carefully. It is. He didn't look away. Is it accurate? She thought about the secondary receipt log she'd completed that morning. The account audit. The survey notation. The transfer clause. The 12 pages of catalog in the first week and the 3 weeks of systematic work that had followed it. She thought about what Greenfield had said at the boundary meeting and what she'd known in the autumn gathering and what she'd found in 11 minutes when $460 of Caldwell money was at stake. Yes, she said, it's accurate. Then that's what you are. He said it with the finality of a man issuing an instruction, which was exactly what it was. The compensation will be adjusted accordingly. Henry will work out the details. He was already turning towards the door when Eleanor said quietly, Mr. Caldwell? He stopped. Why? She asked. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. You could have kept the arrangement as it was. You've been getting the same work regardless of what it was called. He turned back to face her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before. Not the tightness of a man being careful, but the particular look of someone saying something true. Because it was inaccurate, he said. And I've been finding lately that inaccuracy costs more than I used to think. He left. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment before she reached for her pen. Victoria Ashford asked to speak with Eleanor privately 2 days later. Not in the library, in the small sitting room off the east corridor that the household had tacitly assigned to Victoria during her extended stay. Eleanor arrived to find her already seated, her hands folded in her lap, with the deliberate composure of someone who had been composing herself for a while. Thank you for coming, Victoria said, which was a gracious formality under the circumstances. Eleanor had been summoned, not invited, though the summons had been phrased with exquisite politeness. Eleanor sat down. Victoria looked at her hands for a moment. When she looked up, her gray eyes were steady and direct. In a way they hadn't been before. Something had shifted in the composed surface of her, and Eleanor found herself recalibrating. I'm going to say something, Victoria said, and I want you to hear it in the spirit in which it's meant, which is honest and without malice. Eleanor waited. Nathaniel and I have been understood to be moving toward a formal engagement for approximately 2 years. Victoria kept her voice even. Not announced. Virginia society doesn't require an announcement for a fact to be common knowledge. It has been expected by our families, by our circle, and by both of us. She paused. I want to tell you what I've been watching for the past month, Miss Bennett. Eleanor kept her hands still in her lap. She did not allow herself to look away. I've watched Nathaniel Caldwell, Victoria continued, go from a man who predicted your departure with complete confidence, to a man who brings coffee to the library at 10 in the evening, to a man who restructured your employment title and compensation without being asked by anyone other than you. Her voice did not waver. I've watched him seek your opinion on things he has never sought anyone's opinion on. I've watched him defend your presence in a room when you were not there to know he was doing it. Eleanor's heart was doing something it had no business doing, and she managed it the same way she managed everything, by breathing carefully and keeping her face composed. Miss Ashford, she began. I'm not finished. Victoria's voice was gentle and entirely firm. I want to tell you what I've also been watching in myself, because that's the part that matters more. She unclasped her hands and looked at them as though reading something written there. I have been telling myself for 2 years that Nathaniel and I would be a sensible match. Not a passionate one. I'm not a girl, and I don't require passion. but a partnership of two people who understand each other's world and will manage it competently together. A pause. I believe that. I'm not certain any longer that he did. The sitting room was very quiet. Eleanor said carefully, I know, Victoria said. That's what's made it so clear. She looked up. If you had pursued him, or performed for him, or positioned yourself deliberately that I could dismiss, that would be a familiar story. But you simply worked. You simply were who you are. And he stopped looking at the room and started looking at you. She let that land. That's not a thing I can compete with. And I want you to understand, I'm not trying to. Eleanor sat very still. What are you saying? She asked quietly. I'm saying, Victoria said with the precise composure of a woman who had arrived at this decision through considerable private work and was not going to let it be any less dignified for having been difficult, that I intend to speak with Nathaniel. Not to accuse, not to demand, not to perform an ending dramatically. Simply to tell him what I've told you, that I see what I see, and that I think we have both been operating on an understanding that may no longer reflect what is actually true. Eleanor pressed her hands flat against her knees. He hasn't said anything to me, she said. There hasn't been any declaration, any indication that... No. Victoria almost smiled. He wouldn't. He's still deciding whether he's allowed to. That's the part that I think he needs someone to release him from. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was complicated and clear at the same time. I want you to know, Miss Bennett, that what I'm doing for my own sake as much as anything. I would rather end something gracefully than wait for it to end badly. That's not nobility. That's practicality. Eleanor thought about practicality. She thought about the two of them herself and Victoria Ashford sitting in a room in 1818 Virginia. Two women navigating the small and enormous geography of what was permitted and what was possible, with more honesty between them than most people managed in a decade. You're a remarkable person, Eleanor said quietly. Victoria raised an eyebrow. I'm a practical one. Then more softly. Though I'll confess the two have sometimes been the same thing in my experience. She stood, which ended the conversation in the way that a woman with social authority ends conversations gracefully, without leaving room for more to be said than had been said. She offered Eleanor her hand, and Eleanor took it, and they shook as two women who had understood each other. At the door, Victoria paused. The blue dress was the right choice, she said, which was not about the dress at all, and they both knew it. Nathaniel had the conversation with Victoria that same evening. Eleanor didn't know the content. She was not meant to, and she would not have tried to find out. But she knew it had happened, because the following morning, Victoria's maid began quietly organizing for departure, and Victoria herself appeared at the library door with the composed expression of someone who has laid down something heavy and is learning the new feeling of her own hands without it. I'm leaving day after tomorrow, Victoria said simply. I wanted you to know from me. Eleanor stood. Are you all right? The question was genuine. Victoria looked at it, and her composure shifted slightly, not cracking, but softening at the edges. She considered. I'm better than I expected to be, which I think means I'm more relieved than I'm sad, and that tells me something I should have known sooner. Eleanor nodded. I hope you'll find, she started. I will, Victoria said, with complete certainty. The certainty of a woman who knew her own value and was not going to let the end of one thing convince her otherwise. I always do. She left and Eleanor sat back down at her desk, and the library settled around her with the particular quality of a moment that had just shifted the shape of something. She didn't allow herself to think too directly about what it had shifted. Not yet. There were 3 account entries to complete and a land survey to cross-reference, and the secondary log needed updating from the past 2 days. The work was still there. The work was always still there. She picked up her pen. What she hadn't prepared for was what happened 3 days later, when Nathaniel came to the library, not at the end of the day, not in the context of an estate problem, not because Henry had sent him or a document needed locating, but in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with nothing in his hands and nothing on his face, she could immediately catalog. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he came in. Eleanor set her pen down and waited. He moved to the center of the room and then stopped, which was unlike him. Nathaniel Caldwell was a man who always knew exactly where he intended to stand. "I've been trying to work out," he said slowly, "what to say to you. I've been working on it for several days." Eleanor kept her hands flat on the table. "I'll be honest with you," he continued. "I don't find this." He made a brief, precise gesture that encompassed himself and the space between them and whatever this was. "Easy. I'm not a man who was built for uncertainty. I manage land and accounts and people and problems, and those things have answers. You can work toward an answer with enough information." He stopped. Tried again. "You are not a problem I can solve." Eleanor looked at him. "I don't believe I asked to be solved," she said quietly. Something crossed his face. "No, you didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been here just under a month." 26 days, she said, "counting the day I arrived." "In 26 days," he said, "you've recovered $600 worth of fraudulent payments, preserved 30 acres of estate land, from a boundary claim prevented a $400 default fraud, reorganized 12 years of records into a system that anyone can navigate, and trained the household to think about documentation in a way it never did before." He paused. "You've also managed to make Henry Whitaker, who has been skeptical of every new person I've employed in 18 years, come to me 3 separate times to tell me unprompted that I was wrong about you." Eleanor kept her face still. "Henry is a man of considerable judgment," she said. "Hi is. That's why I listen to him." Nathaniel looked at her with the directness she'd been half afraid of and half waiting for. "I was wrong about you, Miss Bennett. I made my assessment before I looked. I looked at what you weren't and decided that was sufficient information, and it wasn't, and I knew it within the first week and didn't say so clearly enough." The words came out measured, deliberate. He was not a man who spoke carelessly, and this was not careless speech. "I told you it was poorly done. I want you to understand that I don't use that phrase lightly. I knew what I was saying." Eleanor sat with that. "I know you did," she said. "Victoria has gone," he said. "A statement, not a question." "Yes." "You know we spoke." "Yes." She kept her gaze level. "She came to me beforehand. She's an extraordinary person." "She is." Nathaniel agreed with the particular respect of a man who had arrived at a full understanding of someone's quality, a little too late to have been fair to it. "She told me that she was releasing me from something. I think she was being more honest about the situation than I'd managed to be with myself." Eleanor waited. "I don't know," Nathaniel said carefully. "What you feel. I am not going to presume. What I know is that I would like—" He stopped. He was working through something. "I have spent 26 days looking at a woman who refused to perform for my approval, who kept working when everyone around her expected her to stop, who treated this estate's problems as though they were hers to solve before they became mine to regret." He kept his gaze steady. "I don't know the word for what I feel, but I know it's not nothing. And I've spent enough of my life being too certain too quickly to make the same mistake in the other direction and pretend it isn't there." The room was very still. Eleanor pressed her hands flat against the edge of the desk. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I am a minister's daughter from Culpeper County. I have no family connections, no social standing, and no resources beyond my own competence. I am employed in your house. The distance between my position and yours is not a small thing. It is not something to be set aside with a look or a declaration and then quietly forgotten." "I know that," he said. "Do you—" She looked at him directly. "Because I need you to understand that I'm not telling you this to diminish what you've said. I'm telling you this because if you're saying what I think you're saying, you need to have said it with full knowledge of what it means. What it means for my standing here, for what people will say, for the position I've built on the work I've done." She paused. "I will not be a secret. I will not be a consideration. I've spent 26 days building something in this house with my own hands, and I will not allow any part of it, any part of what I am, to be something you are uncertain about in company. Something changed in Nathaniel's face. Not surprise, something past surprise. Something that looked, she thought, like recognition. "No," he said quietly. "You won't." He crossed the room, not rushing deliberately the way a man moves when he's decided something and is done being uncertain about it. He stopped at the edge of the work table close enough that she could see the exact quality of his expression, which was not soft exactly, but opened the particular openness of a person who has stopped managing their own face. "I haven't been uncertain in company," he said. "I've been uncertain with myself. There is a difference." He held her gaze. "What I said to Henry about you on the first day, I said it out loud. Deliberately. I want to correct it as loudly as I said it." Eleanor breathed carefully. "That's not how Virginia works," she said. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It isn't. But you've been demonstrating to me for 4 weeks that the way things have always been done is not automatically the way they should be done, and I find I'm inclined to agree with you." A beat of silence. Eleanor looked at this man who had looked out a window at her arrival and seen only what she lacked, and who was now standing in the library. He had once considered her temporary assignment with an expression that held none of the certainty she'd heard in his voice on the first day. Just the harder, truer thing that uncertainty sometimes became when a person was brave enough to let it. She thought about 7 days. She thought about 26 days. She thought about the notebook in her desk drawer with October 14th written at the top of a fresh page and all the pages since. "I need time," she said quietly. "Not because I'm uncertain about my own mind. Because I want to be sure that what you're offering is what you think it is, and not what the month has made it seem." "That's fair," Nathaniel said. "I'll keep working," she told him. "I'll do the same work I've been doing. I'm not going to change anything about how I conduct myself in this house." "I wouldn't want you to." She looked at him steadily. "If you wake up next week and discover that you've been moved by gratitude rather than by something more durable, I would prefer to know it sooner rather than later." He looked at her with something she was finally starting to be able to read. Not the shuttered quality she'd catalogued in the first days, but something underneath it that had been there all along waiting for the right set of eyes. "Miss Bennett," he said with the particular quiet of a man who has made up his mind and is not going to be talked out of it. "I have been grateful to 4 people in my adult life. I did not want to know what any of them thought of the state of the parlor curtains." Eleanor sat with that. Then, because she was Eleanor Bennett, and she did not perform anything, and she had not started now, she allowed herself a small, real smile. "The parlor curtains," she said, "are entirely adequate." Nathaniel's expression shifted into something she had never once seen on his face in 26 days, something lighter than everything she'd catalogued, something that belonged to a man rather than a landowner. He inclined his head. He moved toward the door with the unhurried step of a man who was not retreating, but simply allowing time to be what time needed to be. At the threshold he stopped. 26 days, he said without turning. "I've been counting too." He walked out, and the library held his absence, the way a room holds warmth after someone has left it, and Eleanor sat for a long moment, without reaching for her pen. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page, wrote the date at the top, and began a new entry. The handwriting was as steady as it always was, but her heart, if anyone had thought to ask, was doing something entirely its own. The time Nathaniel asked for came and went in the way of Virginia. November quietly, with a cold that settled into everything and made the days shorter and more deliberate. Eleanor worked. She had always worked, and she worked now with the same systematic attention she had brought to the first week, the second, the third. The secondary receipt log filled steadily. The cross-reference index grew 2 more sections as new documents arrived from the county clerk. The tenant agreements for the spring quarter were organized and reviewed and filed in a configuration that any solicitor in Richmond could navigate without assistance. She did not wait for Nathaniel. Waiting was not something she did, or rather she had learned to make waiting indistinguishable from working, which meant she never truly waited at all. But she noticed things. She noticed that he came to the library more often than estate business required. She noticed that when Henry brought questions to her desk, Nathaniel was sometimes behind him, listening to her answers with the particular quality of attention he'd developed over the past month. Not supervisory attention, not the attention of an employer, measuring an employee's performance, but the attention of a person who finds another person's thinking genuinely interesting. She noticed that he had stopped using her formal title when they were alone. Not that he used her given name. That would have been a declaration of a specific kind. And Nathaniel Caldwell was a man who meant what he said, and therefore did not say things until he was certain he meant them. But the particular way he said Miss Bennett in company, and something slightly different when the library door was closed, a quieter version with less architecture in it, she noticed that too. She wrote none of this in the notebook. Some things were not for cataloging. The difficulty arrived on a Thursday, which was not a day Eleanor had marked for difficulty, because difficulty rarely announced itself in advance. It arrived in the form of a letter delivered to the library by Clara, with slightly wide eyes and the air of someone carrying something heavier than paper. The letter was from a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Alcott, the wife of James Alcott, who had left the estate 6 weeks ago, and whose name had not been spoken in the household since. Eleanor broke the seal with the careful hands of someone who understood that the content might be various things, none of them simple. The letter was 2 pages. Eleanor read it twice before she set it down. Dorothea Alcott was not writing to threaten. She was writing because her husband had told her in the weeks since his dismissal that the new records keeper at Caldwell Estate had found the irregularities in the accounts. She was writing because she wanted someone to know the full truth, and she had concluded from what her husband had described of Eleanor Bennett, that Eleanor Bennett was a person who would hear the full truth without using it as a weapon. The full truth was this: James Alcott had not kept the money. 3 of the 7 fraudulent payments had gone to his wife's family. The actual R. Greer of Staunton, who was a real person. Dorothea's uncle, and who had been facing the loss of his farm after 2 consecutive failed harvests. Alcott had directed estate funds to keep the farm from foreclosure. The remaining 4 payments had gone to a debt Alcott had carried since before he came to Caldwell Estate, a debt he had never told his employer about, because it was the kind of debt a man in his position could not have and keep his position. He had not enriched himself. He had kept his family afloat and his uncle's land in the family, and he had known every time he did it that he was stealing. And he had done it anyway, because the alternative was watching people he loved lose what they could not afford to lose. Dorothea was not asking for leniency. She was not asking for anything. She was only asking that someone know. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about James Alcott, whom she had never met, who had been dismissed quietly and without public humiliation, because Eleanor had specifically recommended that course. She thought about $600 spread over 4 years, and what $600 meant to a family that needed it desperately enough to risk everything to get it. She thought about the particular shape of desperation, not the dramatic kind, not the sudden crisis kind, but the slow, grinding kind that wore a person down year by year until doing something you knew was wrong felt like the only thing left to do. She did not think it excused what Alcott had done, but she understood it in a way that changed the texture of the thing. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her desk drawer. Not the locked one, the regular one, and went to find Nathaniel. How was in the estate office, which was where he spent his mornings when he wasn't riding the property. She knocked, which she had started doing sometime in the past 2 weeks without quite deciding to. "Come in." She came in and set the letter on his desk and stood while he read it. He read slowly. She watched his face move through several things, the controlled expression, then a tightening around the jaw, then something more complicated settling in underneath. He finished, set the letter down, and was quiet for a moment. "She's telling the truth," he said at last. Not a question. "I believe she is," Eleanor said. "The payments to the Greer account. Dorothea's uncle is a real person with a real farm in Augusta County. The debt Alcott carried, I have no way to verify it, but the amount and the timeline are consistent with the pattern in the accounts. A man who was simply taking money for himself would have distributed it differently." Nathaniel looked at the letter. He stole from this estate to keep his wife's uncle from losing his land. "Yes. That doesn't make it legal." "No, it doesn't. But it changes." He stopped, pressed his fingers briefly against his forehead. It changes what the story is. Yes, Eleanor said quietly. It does. Howe was silent for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the estate going about its morning, the distant sound of someone working in the yard, the rhythm of a household that had continued steadily, even through all the upheaval of the past 6 weeks. "What would you do?" he asked. She kept her hands at her sides. "The legal matter is settled," she said carefully. "He's gone, the payments have stopped, the account is clean going forward. There's nothing to prosecute that hasn't already been addressed by his dismissal." She paused. "Dorothea Alcott's uncle still has his farm. That's done, and can't be undone, and attempting to recover those funds from a family that needed them desperately enough to risk everything would cost more in legal fees than the sum recovered." "So you'd let it go?" "I'd let the accounting go. But I'd write Dorothea Alcott a letter acknowledging that her letter was received." She kept her voice even. She wrote because she wanted someone to know the full truth. Knowing that someone received and understood it is the only thing she asked for, even without asking directly. Nathaniel looked up at her. "That's a kind way to think about it," he said. "It's an accurate way," she said. "Kindness and accuracy are not always the same thing. In this case, they happen to be." He nodded slowly. He picked up the letter, read the last paragraph once more, and set it down with the careful finality of someone placing something in its permanent position. "I'll write the letter myself," he said. "Would you?" He stopped. "I'd value your opinion on the wording if you're willing." Eleanor looked at him. 3 months ago, or even 6 weeks ago, Nathaniel Caldwell would not have asked Eleanor Bennett for her opinion on a letter he intended to write. He would have written it and sent it and considered the matter closed. The fact that he was asking now was not a small thing, and they both understood that. "Of course," she said. "Whenever you're ready." The letter to Dorothea Alcott was drafted that afternoon and sent the following morning. Eleanor read the final version and thought it was better than she could have written herself. It had Nathaniel's particular economy of language, the way he stripped everything to what was essential, and left it there without ornamentation, and what was essential in this case was "we know and we understand, and it is finished." She thought it was one of the finest letters she had read. She didn't tell him that. She handed it back and said, "This will serve," and his mouth did the small thing she had learned was the closest he usually came to showing that a thing had pleased him. What happened the following Monday was something Eleanor had not anticipated, which was unusual. She was a woman who anticipated most things. Henry came to the library at 10:30 with his formal expression, which was the expression he wore when he was about to say something that had been decided above him and was not entirely his preference to deliver. "There are 2 men from Richmond," he said, "associates of Judge Ashford." Eleanor kept her face still. "Miss Ashford's father," she said. "Yes, they've come to speak with Mr. Caldwell about the change in his situation with respect to the Ashford family." Henry kept his voice carefully level. "Ashford is not pleased. He has apparently characterized the ending of the engagement as irregular." "Irregular," Eleanor repeated, and connected the irregularity to the presence of a new employee. Henry's eyes held hers directly. "Your name has been mentioned, Miss Bennett." The room was very quiet. Eleanor absorbed this with the same stillness she brought to everything. Not because she was unaffected, but because being visibly affected would not change the facts and would make managing the facts considerably harder. "What's being said?" she asked. Henry's jaw tightened. "That you positioned yourself deliberately. That the work was secondary to other objectives." She breathed carefully. "And Mr. Caldwell's response?" "He's with them now." She nodded once. She turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen and held it, not writing, just holding it, the familiar weight of it in her hand, the thing she reached for when the world required managing. "Henry." Her voice was steady. "Whatever is said in that room, my work speaks for itself. The index, the audit, the survey, the boundary filing. Those things exist, and they are accurate, and they were done for the estate's benefit, and not for any other purpose. If Judge Ashford's associates want to examine the record of my work, they are welcome to do so." Henry looked at her with something in his face she recognized as the expression he'd worn the first morning he'd brought her tea alongside the account ledgers. The expression of a man who has revised his understanding of a person and is not going to revise it back. "Yes, miss," he said quietly. "I'll tell them that." He left, and Eleanor sat with her pen, and the library held its breath around her. She heard the men from Richmond leave an hour later, the sound of horses in the drive, the particular quality of a departure that has not concluded as the departing parties intended. She did not go to the window. She did not ask Clara what had been said. She was completing an index entry, the last of a set of tenant agreements she'd been cross-referencing for 2 days, when Nathaniel came to the library. He walked in and closed the door and stood with his hands at his sides, which was a different posture from all his others, not behind his back, not clasped, just at his sides open. She had not seen him stand that way before. "They told me," he said, "that I had allowed a minister's daughter with no family and no standing to insinuate herself into my household and compromise my engagement through deliberate calculation." His voice was entirely flat. "They used the word insinuate 3 times. I counted." Eleanor set her pen down. "What did you tell them?" "I told them that Eleanor Bennett had been employed by this estate as records keeper, subsequently recognized as estate administrator, based on the scope of her demonstrated work, and that my personal affairs were not a subject on which I required the counsel of Judge Ashford's representatives." He paused. "I also told them that if the judge wished to characterize the ending of his daughter's understanding with me as the result of Miss Bennett's conduct rather than my own, he was welcome to, but that Victoria had ended the engagement herself of her own judgment and will, and that her judgment was impeccable." Eleanor was very still. "They pushed," she said. "They did. And I told them to get off my land." He said it without drama, without emphasis, in exactly the same tone he'd used for everything else. "Those were the words I used, exactly those." Eleanor looked at him across the library, across the index, and the files, and the receipts, and the 6 weeks of work that had changed the shape of this house, and both of their understandings of it, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too specific to be anything other than what it was. Nathaniel. She used his given name for the first time, and it settled between them like something that had been waiting. He crossed the room. He stopped at her desk, and he looked at her with that open posture and the expression she had spent weeks learning to read. And she saw in it now everything she had catalogued, and also everything she hadn't been able to name yet. The respect and the frustration and the coffee at 10 o'clock and 26 days being counted by both of them. "I made a decision the day you arrived," he said quietly. "I made it quickly and incorrectly, and I made it out loud, and I want to spend—" He stopped. Started again with the care of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. "I would like to spend a considerable amount of time correcting it, if you'll let me." Eleanor stood. She was not a tall woman, and Nathaniel Caldwell was not a small man, and she looked up at him, and she was not afraid, and she was not performing, and she was not managing anything at all, which was the most unusual feeling she'd had in recent memory. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want you to know that before you decide anything. I keep the secondary receipt log, and I notice the things that don't add up, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong." She held his gaze. "I told you on the first day that your opinion of the outcome didn't change what the work required. That's not going to change because you've asked me to dinner." Something lit in his face. "I haven't asked you to dinner," he said. "You were going to." "I was." The something in his face was warmer now. "Is that a yes?" Eleanor let the moment hold for exactly as long as it deserved. "The survey," she said, "the accounts, the boundary claim, the transfer clause, Hayward's receipt. I did all of those things because they needed doing, and the estate required them. Not for you." "I know," he said. "But I stayed." She held his gaze. "I stayed when I didn't have to, and that—" She paused. "That was for me. Because this is a place worth staying in. Because the work is real, and the problems are genuine, and I am good at this in a way I have never been asked to be good at anything before." A breath. And because somewhere in the past 6 weeks, the man who said I wouldn't last 7 days has become someone I find I would like to know better. Nathaniel Caldwell looked at her with the full attention of a man who has learned at some cost what attention actually means. "Then know me better," he said simply. Henry Whittaker heard about the departure of Judge Ashford's representatives from Clara, who had heard it from Robert, who had been close enough to the front drive to witness the specific quality of the goodbye, which was by all accounts not a warm one. Henry received this information, processed it, and went to the kitchen to make 2 cups of coffee because it was the middle of the afternoon, and that wasn't customary, but some days were not customary days. He brought one to his own office. He left the other outside the library door, knocked once, and walked away without waiting to see who answered it. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the weeks before. Not easier exactly, because nothing about Caldwell Estate was simple, and nothing about 2 particular and strong-willed people learning each other's thinking was simple either. But they had the quality of things that are moving in the right direction, which is a different feeling from things that are simply moving. Eleanor kept her title. She kept her desk, her index, her secondary receipt log, her locked drawer. She kept the notebook with October 14th at the top of the first page. What she added gradually and without performance was the particular knowledge of a person who has decided to be fully present in a place not as a guest, not as an employee, awaiting dismissal, but as someone who has chosen to be exactly where she is. She attended the December gathering at the estate, not as the records keeper available in the library, but as a guest. Nathaniel had been direct about this, and Eleanor had accepted it without either excessive gratitude or false modesty, because it was an accurate change in her standing, and she dealt in accurate things. Mrs. Cartwright was there. The woman whose pleasant voice had told Eleanor to run along in October looked across the room in December and found Eleanor Bennett standing in conversation with Greenfield the solicitor and one of the neighboring landowners, speaking with the ease of someone who belonged precisely where she was. Mrs. Cartwright looked and recalibrated and did not say run along. Eleanor noticed. She let it go without satisfaction and without heat, which was its own kind of satisfaction. The question that Virginia society had been turning over what exactly was Eleanor Bennett to Nathaniel Caldwell answered itself in the way that genuine things answered themselves, which was slowly in full view without drama. He sought her company, and she gave it. He valued her opinion, and she offered it. He told the truth about things in her presence that he didn't tell in others, and she told him when she thought he was wrong, which was not infrequently, and he listened in the particular way of a man who has learned that being wrong occasionally is not the same as being diminished. Henry Whittaker, for his part, stopped raising his eyebrows when Nathaniel spent Tuesday mornings in the library rather than the estate office. He simply adjusted the schedule the way a good steward adjusts for facts on the ground. Robert the footman carried 2 cups of tea to the library in the mornings without being asked. Clara noted in the private record she kept nowhere, except her own memory, that Miss Bennett's expression had a different quality than it used to, not softer exactly. Steadier. The expression of a woman who knows precisely where she is. In the second week of December, on a morning when the cold had settled in for good, and the household had begun the particular preparations for winter that a large estate required, Nathaniel found Eleanor in the library before breakfast. This was not unusual. She was almost always there before breakfast. What was unusual was that he came in and sat down, not at the work table, but in the chair across from her desk, the way a person sits when they intend to stay. Eleanor looked up. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you told me, that you stayed for yourself, because the work was real and worth doing." "Yes," she said. "I want to ask you something." He kept his gaze level and direct. "Is it still true that you're here for the work?" She looked at him, at the man who had looked out a window and decided she was temporary, and who had been wrong in every possible way, and who had been honest enough about being wrong to say it clearly and to mean it. "The work is still real," she said. "The work still matters." She set her pen down. "But no, it's not only that anymore." Something in his face, the careful, constructed control of it, released. Just slightly. Just enough. "Good," he said, quiet and certain the way he said things when he meant them completely. "Because I have no interest in being a man who asks a woman to be somewhere she doesn't choose to be." Eleanor leaned back in her chair and looked at him with the full attention of someone who has learned slowly and at some cost what it means to trust another person's character rather than simply their words. "Then you're not," she told him. He reached across his desk, not grabbing, not dramatic, just the deliberate extension of a hand from a man who meant what he did. And she took it, and they sat in the library of Caldwell Estate in the early morning of a December day in Virginia in 1818. Two people who had been wrong about each other in all the ways that mattered, and right about each other in the only way that mattered more. The index was complete. The records were in order. The accounts were clean, and the boundaries were settled, and the fraudulent claim was done, and the receipt log was current to the day. The work that had needed doing was done, and Eleanor Bennett, who had been told she wouldn't last 7 days, had stayed, not because she had no choice. Not because she had proven something to someone who had underestimated her, but because this was where she had chosen to be, and she was a woman who, when she made a choice, made it completely. That was enough. That had always been enough. And in the end, it was the only thing that had ever mattered at all.